Now we bring to you a power-packed panel discussion on pursuit of happiness, better governance, and sustainable future. In this discussion, veteran leaders will decode the pursuit of happiness through better governance and right focus needed for strategizing for sustainability, how to deliver for the future. This session will be moderated by Amol Dete, editor, ETCFO. Over to you, Amol.
Hello and welcome to the first session of the day. As I mentioned in my opening speech, the reasons behind choosing the theme Race Against Time, Sustainability and Future of Finance is because of the rise of ESG or sustainable finance and the importance of adopting it from the CFO's level. The whole CFO fraternity is going through various challenges, whether to forecast for the short term or long term, and how to adopt sustainability as a factor. We are all racing against time. So on the sustainability front, recently a report launched by Deloitte says that Indian businesses rank 5th in their concern for climate change. About 80% of Indian executives see the world at a tipping point for responding to climate change. About 94% of Indian CXOs agree that taking immediate action can limit the worst impacts of climate change. So at ETCFO Leadership Summit, I'm going to make an attempt to understand from the CFOs and the experts how they are actually racing against time and trying to adopt sustainability and building a future of finance. And ladies and gentlemen, let me take honor to welcome our guests for the first panel today. My first speaker for this panel discussion is Mr. Harsh Bhutani, the CFO of Coca Cola India and Southwest Asia. Mr. Bhutani, glad to have you.
Thanks, all. Pleasure to be here and humbled to be part of this session.
Thank you, Mr. Bhutani. Glad to have you. My next speaker is Mr. Sridhar, the CFO of ABB India. Mr. Sridhar, glad to have you.
Thank you, Amol, and good afternoon to all of you. I am pretty much excited with the engaging discussions what we will have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My next speaker is Mr. Pramod Menon, Group CFO and member of the board, RPG Enterprises. Mr. Menon, glad to have you.
Okay, thanks, Amol, and look forward to engaging discussion on this panel.
Thank you. And I have the industry veteran who has been dealing in corporate governance and many other areas, Mr. Shailesh Haribhakti, the board of director of various companies. Mr. Haribhakti, glad to have you.
Very happy to be here, Amol, and I'm particularly glad that we have this extraordinary panel to discuss this very important subject with.
Thank you, sir. And gentlemen, let me begin with a very common question, which is based on the theme and of this conclave called Leadership Summit. And the question is about the leadership, the changes in the leadership and the key priorities. So I'm not going to ask you about 2022 because, you know, the year, I'm sure all of you must have planned for 2022. And it looks like the year is going to, you know, the COVID or the pandemic will be there till 2022. So my question is about 2023. And the question is, how do you see a shift in leadership and what are your key priorities as a CFO in 2023? And I will start with you, Mr. Bhutani.
Very relevant question. If I look at the priorities, I think the framework for me remains the same. So if I look at the finance priority framework, I put into 4 buckets. Number 1 is enabling growth. How does as a function we enable growth? I think second one is modernizing the function or modernizing the finance function to be ready for the future challenges. Third one is about governance, which will always remain important to ensure that we keep improving and improvising governance as time goes on. And fourth, and the most important, is about people and the culture. Now, while the framework remains the same, I think as you double click in the framework, the components start to change, with the change we are seeing. So for example, if we double click inside enabling growth, and to me, enabling growth has 2 big components. How do we steward the performance management of the company? And then how do we allocate resources, both capital and operating resources, behind the most pressing priorities? And that's where I think you have to start then making a change. For example, in the consumer world today, let's say for a consumer, if health and wellness is becoming a priority, is our innovation pipeline keeping with that? Are we fueling innovation pipeline enough? If e-com is becoming a big channel and there's a channel shift happening, are we investing enough behind those channels to develop those channels? If more and more consumers are moving online, are our media spends moving online in line with the consumer? Are they following consumer, and are we shifting our media spends? So I think resource allocation plays a critical role, and so is the how do you set the performance standard? How do you look outside in to see what's happening in the environment that impacts you, and how do you need to raise your game as an organization to ensure that you remain competitive? So I think they will continue to evolve. Similarly, when you come to modernizing finance, which is all about creating a future of the finance, again, your capabilities will continue to evolve. Yeah. So, for example, in the prior time, a more periodic planning was good enough, but not anymore. Yeah, it's all about scenario planning today. How do you have multiple scenarios which are going on? How do you ensure that you are looking at multiple scenarios and placing your bets around that? I think that's important. Similarly, your entire revenue growth management has become a big dimension with all commodity inflation and the uncertainty in supply chain. How do you ensure that you maximize your revenue? So these skills will need to get enhanced. So again, I think while the framework remains same, 2023 will require a very different level of skills, agility, resource allocation amongst the areas which are emerging than what required, let's say, in the past. And to that extent, I think is what we are trying to adjust our framework.
Noted your points, Mr. Bhutani. Mr. Sridhar, you heard, Mr. Bhutani talking about different buckets and reprioritizing things. How do you see leadership changing in 2023, and what are the key priorities that you see?
Okay, so if I look at what are the sort of the priorities which we are running today and which will take it forward from this year onwards. I mean, we had a couple of years of pandemic, and that has really reset our priorities on different track altogether. First, what remained consistent or constant, I would say, is about how do we perform better in this particular market and satisfy the various stakeholders. That remains one of the baseline requirements, what we need to do. And what gets added to this particular topics are, how do we look into different markets? So that's also an important element where we're trying to get into, because the markets today are expanding exponentially in terms of the varieties. It's just not the depth of it, but the horizontal requirements is absolutely increasing. Other one which is important, very important going forward, will be the people priority. How do we focus on diversity and inclusion? How do we reskill or retrain our people, right? And then, a lot of organizations undertake these engagement surveys as to understand how they could better have a relationship between the employees and the organization. That's also one of the important topics which we want to deal with. And last couple of topics, which is absolutely important, which was actually there, but not focused really in the past, was about how we have a sustainable operations. When we talk of sustainable operations, we talk of the ESGs, we talk of the capital expenditure which is required for the operations. We talk about supplier sustainability, and so on and so forth. Last but not the least is about the governance and integrity, which is the bedrock of having a solid operations on ground, where we cover definitely internal control, assurance, and other topics. So I think these are some of the priorities which we are working with Amol.
Very, very valid points, Mr. Sridhar. Mr. Menon.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very valid subject. And in terms of leadership, which a CFO provides to a particular organization, and looking at from that lens, as you rightly pointed out at the beginning and setting out the context, climate change has been a very critical aspect in terms of a key issue, which is driving not only at the global level, or let's say at an economic level, but even at corporate level. All the companies within our group itself has taken up various kind of targets, depending upon which industry that company operates, in terms of carbon reduction kind of measures. And keeping from a leadership perspective, if I look at it, there are three kind of buckets under which I'm trying to drive. The focus is, first is providing the kind of stewardship in terms of business alignment. because the kind of challenges that the companies today are operating in, and the kind of volatility that we have seen in the last 2 years, whether it's on commodities, whether it's on resources, it's very easy for the business to take out and then miss the larger kind of purpose and then bring into focus. Because on one side you have then requirement from the customers, and there are also regulatory norms which we need to comply with. And what we are seeing is, even let's say a company like in IT sector, where the compliance levels are pretty high, even if let's say our companies have to qualify and win for orders, the compliance to ESG requirements is pretty high, where audits are being undertaken and assessments are being undertaken by third parties like Covadis or CDP. It's important to have, let's say, that alignment, which I believe is one of the key aspects that you're focusing on. The other issue I would say is to bring act as a catalyst to bring to action the entire on the regulatory compliance front, and ensuring that within the organization we have very core governance mechanism in place, with periodic reviews, ensuring that, say, the targets are well identified, and then all these initiatives are well supported by adequate capital budgets are concerned, and creating the kind of right framework. And that's another key kind of focus area within RPG Group. And lastly, another key focus area is to create value through the right kind of reporting standards, and communicating with the various kind of stakeholders. Essentially, all these should lead primarily, in our view, to creating an optimal value for all the stakeholders, and also ensuring that we are enhancing value for the group and the companies. So those are, let's say, the key priorities if I were to put it in 3 buckets, Amol.
Okay, very valid points, Mr. Menon. And Mr. Haribhakti, I will come to you, but I will slightly tweak the question to you according to your expertise. So I would like you to tell us, how do you see CFOs, shift in the CFO's leadership, and what are the key priorities that they should look at in 2023? Because I'm sure you must be advising to a lot of companies and industries.
Yeah, I mean, it is one community with which I work so very closely, and therefore it comes naturally to me to recommend for all of you to consider that there are 3 soft infrastructure factors that ought to be receiving the maximum attention. And those I identify as innovation, very important. Everything is changing so dramatically and continues to change so dramatically that to give it a response, you need to change business models, you need to change your ecosystem, you need to change the channels, and so many different things. D2C, for example, is becoming the new paradigm that everybody is looking for. The second soft infrastructure is digitalization. The time has come for us to convert all physical realities to digital form so that they can be understood, analyzed, and scenario analysis done in order to get the maximum output from your interaction with the ecosystem. So that would be my second, and what that will lead to in 5-6 years' time is complete blockchaining of all accounting. This is my prediction. And full robotization of all auditing. Because what you need is an outside-in, inside-out perspective. It's no longer enough to think about your own organization alone. It's the whole ecosystem, how that influences you and how you influence the ecosystem. These 2 inside-out, outside-in relationships will define your success and your ability to continue to be ahead of competition and really meet all your aspirational goals. And finally, but most importantly, it is sustainability. And sustainability, to my mind, encompasses everything that we have done so far. It encompasses the CSR that we are also familiar with. It's now getting subsumed into environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and purposeful governance. And that is going to be the big challenge, bringing technology to this. So I keep saying to people, whoever will listen to me, that you need an ERP for ESG. It is no longer important to just have an SAP system which monitors and measures your financial performance. It is critical to capture all data sets and be able to create how you have done on 6 capitals of integrated thinking and integrated reporting, as opposed to only the financial capital that all of us are so familiar with. And so there needs a total mindset change about data capture. I want to eliminate data entry, and I want to bring in just data set capture. So that not only is it captured at source, blockchain, controlled, made analytical, and provides automatic comfort to all of you about control and all of that we desire. And the hard infrastructure is of scale, very critical. India is on an absolute growth path and rapid growth path. I will not be surprised if we move past our 8 and 9% estimates and move into double digits in the next 2 or 3 years. The momentum has been built, and it is for all of us in the financial system to take India to this double-digit growth paradigm. Second is that we need to keep margins which will enable not only us to reinvest in our businesses and allocate capital well, but also to democratize costs for the vast population that you will serve. The scale will come because you're serving such a large quantum. So you'll have to start thinking of margin in gross terms, not in terms of how much you make for every transaction, but how your scale will drive your overall margin. And finally, perhaps most importantly, the customer experience with your organizations. And you have the finest organizations in the world represented on this panel. And I'm sure that's an obsessive thought process with all of you to make sure that customer salience, customer experience, delight, all of that becomes the remit of the work that you do. So those are my 3 soft and 3 hard factors which should be driving CEO mindset as we go forward.
Very well said, sir. And I think valuable thoughts here. So let me, try to deep dive and ask some specific questions about the topic that we have for the discussion today. And let me bring back Mr. Bhutani here. So, Mr. Bhutani, if you could, add on, what are the constraints and how can one overcome challenges of implementing long-term sustainability plans and not at the cost of short term? Because the whole dynamic of planning has changed in the last 2 years, but now we have to think more about the sustainability planning for a longer term.
This is possibly one of the tough questions that I'm sure all of us go through every year, every day. Now, if I look at constraints, I'll broadly divide them into 2 sections. Yeah, one, they are internal constraints, and internal constraints to my mind, which are most solvable by each organization, but they are more about, do you have the clear goals of your ESG? What do you want to do? Which are the areas you want to prioritize, and what is the roadmap that you have? Do you have the right capabilities? Because oftentimes, if you don't back up your goals with the right capabilities, implementation suffers. So do you have right capabilities? And then last but not the least, do you have the resources allocated behind those goals so that they can be done? So those are some of the internal constraints which I'm sure each organization goes through and they're able to solve it. But when it comes to external constraints, they could be around regulation. For example, if we want to get the plastic recyclability, which is a critical focus area for us, our regulation currently don't allow recycled plastic to be used back in packaging. So there is an unlock that needs to happen from government side to ensure that that agenda can move forward with much more speed. Then that could be infrastructure. Yeah, so infrastructure takes time to develop. Yeah, it's once the unlock happens, it's industry has to come together and invest for the infrastructure to be created so that you can take it up. So how do you create the infrastructure, and And that's where I think industry has to come together. It's not about one company. The moment industry comes together, you are able to do it faster. And to that extent, I think industry partnerships become important. So as an organization, I think we have to work on both. Obviously, internal constraints is something we have to remove. External constraints are something which will require a lot more partnerships, a lot more advocacy, a lot more of industry coming together for a common cause and working on a common cause, because that way you will be able to move a needle faster. As it comes to Amol, the short term versus long term, of course, it has to be balanced. And there are many levers in the P&L, and you have to prioritize what is the most important thing for you to do. So if you do a consistent effort, I think it makes it easier. But at times, if you have to make a big initiative or a big investment, I think organizations have to become bold to do that. From more long-term perspective, there could be a challenge on short term. And my belief is that consumers, investors are more ready nowadays. They're more aware and they're more ready. If a company is investing and sort of impacting short term for a long term sustainable goal, I think there is much more acceptance on that. So we can be bolder there. So that's my broad views on this.
Noted your points. I guess the acceptance is also because the government is also heading in that direction. They also made a commitment of going for carbon zero or carbon neutral. So again, noted points, valid points here, Mr. Bhutani. Let me bring you back, Mr. Sridhar. And my question is more about the non-financial information. So the government may come with an ESG metrics very soon, and disclosure of non-financial information is going to be also very critical going ahead. So what does that mean for you? How will it help, or what kind of information do you think should be there in non-financial information? Because ultimately, there has to be some standardization of non-financial information as well going ahead.
Amol, thanks for the question. I think first of all, now the investor mindset is undergone a radical change, right? From what people used to see only the financial information to make decisions, I think going forward, the investors are now going to see how a company is holistically driving the operations within the country and within the organization, right? So for that, the availability of non-financial information is a very, very key input going forward to the investors. I think investors would like to commit themselves with organizations with look at a long term, even though if it is at the cost of a short term for the temporary, because that's where they see that the risks are well seen on a long-term basis and well protected. So that's important. That's basically a change in the investor mindset, number one. And number two, why this change? I think it's just not only for profit gains or the value gains what they're looking at. At the end of the day, the organizations should strive to make this world a livable planet for the generations to come. And that's a very important human element within which these type of objectives come into play. And that's what it's really meaning for us, that when we basically run an operation and we are in charge to make sure to bring this change, and the impact which we create by adopting these particular norms goes a long way in serving the customers, serving the various stakeholders, the employees, and the families with whom we work with. So that's absolutely pretty much important, right? So how do we now going to make this change? I think the first step, earlier, there used to be a lot of commentaries which used to be written in the reports what we normally publish. I think going forward, that would be more data driven, right?
Okay.
The first initial step, what has been sort of rolled out by the SEBI and other authorities, is about the publishing of the BRSR report. I think that is the first change. That's no doubt is complicated at the first step to get all the information what is required to give a meaningful BRSR. But I think, but it's a journey. But over a period of time, the organizations will learn how to do it and have their sort of systems aligned to get the data what is required. And there, I think, instead of moving from a narrative and a descriptive step, it will go to a more data-driven decisions, which is absolutely very, very interesting for people who look at it. So I think my view is as CFOs, we need to really adapt this particular change, make sure that we run our operations in such a way that we get the data and give this data back, and that information is used to run a more holistically strong organization.
Noted your points, Mr. Sridhar. Mr. Menon, let me come to you. Uh, and obviously, as we understand that we have to make this planet livable, we have to ensure that the journey is going towards the carbon neutral. We need some incentives also, right? Because government has announced plan for 2070, but then there has to be some initiatives from the government side. So if I ask you specifically, what reforms and incentives should be considered by the authorities that is required by the CFOs or the board of directors to develop and disclose and implement a fine corporate sustainable strategy?
Amol, it's a valid issue which is very hotly debated across different economies. And if you look at the world and couple of, let's say, countries which are today leading in terms of ESG compliance or sustainability on the sustainability index worldwide, and especially in the developed economies, what we have seen is, let's say, countries in Canada or let's say the UK, EU, or even for that matter, US, all of them have come out with various policies, or in terms of either incentives, or they created various sustainability development tech fund, which basically help in terms of there is certain amount of, let's say, innovation, which as my panelist member earlier alluded to, because there's a huge amount of investment which is required as we try to move and create products and services which are more decarbonized. And at this, see, within the overall ESG space, it is the environmental piece where, let's say, there's a huge amount of innovation needs to be carried out. And that's where certain amount of reforms and incentives will always be welcome. So a few of those things in let's say, which I clearly see is on R&D side, Indian companies have to spend heavily. And that's an area, I think, in terms of R&D related incentives, either through tax or reliefs, some holidays, which can be carried out. Similarly, on investment related in the non-R&D space. So few of those tax incentives, especially for this sector, can really give fillip to the overall industry. Another aspect is the overall implementation. It's not that we lack today policies. I'll tell you one key issue which we need is the overall reforms in the power sector, especially on the distribution side. It's so very critical because one of the lowest hanging fruits for the industry to take over is the migration into the renewable space. And today, let's say the policy framework today gives you for net metering and so many other things. But when you go down to the actual implementation at the state level, there's a lot of hesitancy in terms of giving you approvals for those. So a lot of corporates, including us, we are, let's say, ready to make investments, but let's say are not able to go ahead because of lack of approvals. Framework is, so I would say, a couple of those easing of, let's say, implementations can especially help, let's say, companies to go ahead and invest on those. So, and largely, I would say, from a government perspective, let's say, few of those suggestions and the nudges government is taking, let's say, even take the case of the current budget, where government is very, very conscious about how to make the entire EV ecosystem to be created out here. And one of the biggest issues is the charging infrastructure. And that is an issue that they try to address through the battery swapping kind of a policy. So they are receptive to issues, but in my view, issue is acceleration of couple of, let's say, the programs and ensure that on the ground, the execution becomes easier so that a few of those policies, the corporates are in a position to actually leverage on. So we are in the right path, but it's there's a fine balancing which the government needs to do within overall fiscal. But in my view, on the execution, if it can be made more clearer, in my view, a lot of those benefits which we are already covered in the framework can be unlocked.
Meaningful one, Mr. Menon.
Well, I'll just add a dynamic here. Yeah. So as Mr. Haribhakti said in the beginning, that era of single-digit growth is over and India is getting into double-digit growth. Yeah. If you hear our Honorable Prime Minister, he said that India is getting into Amrit Kal, which means that we are at the cusp of explosive growth. And when you look at the net zero goal, along with the explosive growth that industry will experience, I think even to stand at the same place, we'll have to run in terms of policies framework. And if we have to actually make a leap change, it'll require something very different. So something to consider that with the explosive growth that India will go into, the net zero goal, if we have to get into, I think it'll require some pretty dramatic shifts in the way we look at the infrastructure. So just wanted to bring that point in.
No, sure. Thanks, Mr. Bhutani, for adding that. So I will come to you, Mr. Haribhakti. But before that, the globally there is, a rapid movement in this space. In fact, a lot of banks, I cover that area also very aggressively. A lot of banks have globally adopted or embraced a new designation called Chief Sustainability Officer. His job is to look at the companies where they have any strategy towards going towards carbon neutral, or they're making anything like that, and then perhaps the finance decisions will be taken. So that's a great layer which is added into the due diligence. So it's no more about whether the plant is using a mineral water to create or manufacture the right products which can be consumed, but it's also about what do they do with the rest of the water, right? So it's not just about the corporate governance. So my question to you, Haribhakti sir, is how can we build a relationship between the whole corporate governance and the sustainability?
Fantastic question. Let me share with you some context. The context that is emerging is that we will have to depend much, much more on platforms and on portals. So what portals enable you to do is to capture relevant information and see it in context with each other. What the platform enables you to do is, for example, let's say we have a chief sustainability officer. What will he or she have to do to make sure ESG is compliant? They will need a platform which will enable E, S, and G all to be simultaneously adopted. The other two dimensions, by way of context, are the fact that we need to adopt frameworks and we need to adopt standards in order to make sure that this communication is even-handed throughout the world. So if Coca Cola is putting out a sustainability report and talking about its contribution, and if RPG Group is doing similar stuff, then the two should be consumable by the reader of the financial statement in the same way. So I would say what this leads to is two different dimensions of communication. I like to call it the Netflix of sustainability. So what you need to do is your outcomes will not be possible for you to demonstrate in two-dimensional stuff like your print or just your annual report or just your BRSR statement. You will need to put out a video, a film. So your annual report, and I'm encouraging this very solidly wherever I can, should also have a disc which enables people to experience the actions that you have actually performed during the year. So you're getting into net zero. Where have you reached? How do you show that demonstrably that you have made a difference? What have you done to water bodies? Have you gone and cleaned a tributary of the Ganges? Have you gone and cleaned up a lake? Have you done something on a beach? Now, all of these things, very hard to write about it. It's important that it gets communicated in visual format, video, color, interactive if you can. And most importantly, you'll need a TEDx of communication. So it's not the remit of just the CFO or the Chief Sustainability Officer. It is important for the whole organization to cotton on. So we are creating in many places, like in L&T Finance Holdings, we are saying all 22,000 people should get engaged in ESG. So we've got a 30-week calendar of actions that will promote the ESG idea, the sustainability idea. And these are easy things to put into place. We are also at ACC and Ambuja, for example, putting KRAs which are linked to sustainability outcomes. So these are the kind of new approaches that corporate India will have to follow to make sure that the true value of all these new forces that are getting unleashed upon us get captured for the benefit of the corporation and for the benefit of the world. Because it's no longer, as I said, an internal looking thought process. It has to demonstrate that you are part of the whole global ecosystem.
Just to add to, I think, Mr. Haribhakti's views, right? I see this also as a business opportunity for companies which has got technology, which could basically customers, right, adapt this particular APIs or the KR, which help them, right? So that's absolutely another business opportunity. Our context of looking at it as to comply, if it changes and makes a mix between, that is also a business giving opportunity. And I think the ROIs on these ESG stuff will get rather rapid momentum. So that's how we see. That's my 2 cents about your views about it, Mr. Haribhakti.
No, I fully agree with you. Absolutely.
Right. And we have still yet to master that trick, right? We have still don't have those examples which could really talk these volumes, right? So that then the customer gets a confidence. But I think it's a journey. I think every company will add its own dimension to it. But I think at the end of the day, as putting things together to get to an explosive growth, it is important that we save this planet as well. And this is how we go.
What you say makes me say the following. The pull of ESG is going to be from customers. It's going to be customer demanded.
Exactly.
What is appropriate consumption? What is responsible consumption? What is appropriate fashion? All of that will be the voice of the customer telling us. Then there is the voice of the youngsters, the Gen Z, who you want to attract to work with you. They are going to put all the pressure on you to make sure that you seem to be an organization with heart and soul. And most importantly, it's going to be the bankers and the mutual funds who are going to look at your financing. Next year, Europe will stop funding, and this is news that is worthy of noting. Stop funding organizations which do not conform to the ESG paradigm. So there is huge pressure.
Sure, certainly. On that news, I will talk to you personally after the session and opt in some more details. But I think very interesting conversation, and thanks for adding that, Mr. Sridhar and Mr. Haribhakti. I have one more important question for all of you, but before that, let me share something. 5 years back, because I also cover banking and finance very aggressively, I went to IRD office, and it's a new office set up in some different location, which I don't remember now. But you can see all these glass buildings, but a barren land. And I asked someone, the member whom I met, there is nothing, there is no greenery outside the office. And he shared something very nice. He says, we are collecting a fund and trying to build a lagoon outside, IRD office, because they had the huge land of the government and given them. So I think if the organizations work in their own, way, kind of a CSR activity, it's very different. I do not know whether the lagoon is ready there or not, but I think that was a step in the right direction. So let me come back to you, Mr. Bhutani, and ask this question, to all of you, starting with you, Mr. Bhutani, that in a daily operations, how can a CFO build a sustainable future? And what is it that you are doing at your company to head towards a sustainable future? What is that, the layer of leadership that you are adding so that sustainable future will be built in the company?
Yeah, so Amol, to my mind, I think it all starts with, as I said earlier, it all starts with a clear objective. Yeah. So, for example, for our company, the defined purpose is refresh the world and make a difference. And when you say make a difference, it means how do you create a better shared future for everybody you deal with, your stakeholders, your customer, your consumers. And if you remain true to the purpose, and then I think CFO will play a critical role in terms of ensuring that how do you take the purpose, which is the heart and soul of the company, and translate into the actions which can be measured. Yeah. And so what does it mean, let's say for us? So for example, for us, it means that we have taken, and I think we have to also ensure that you put your resources behind high impact areas where you can actually create an impact rather than putting resources behind too many priorities where you don't create an impact. So if you look at the high impact areas from our perspective, and it could be different from different companies, water replenishment, as ensuring that we return more than 100% of water that we use. World without waste, that means we replace or replenish or reuse every bottle of plastic that we produce. Sustainable agriculture, because we work with a lot of fruits. So how do we ensure that we work with farmers on sustainable agriculture and improving yield, improving their livelihoods, becomes important. And so is work with a lot of women entrepreneurs. We have a program called 5x20 where we work with women entrepreneurs to ensure that we give them sustainable life. And as you define your objectives, and then how do you allocate resources? How do you ensure that you are investing behind capabilities? I keep coming back to capabilities because you may have everything. You may have good intention, you may have resources, but if you don't have capabilities that you have built in the organization, then none of this will come to light. So how do you build those capabilities? How do you measure them? Because that's another very nascent area. How do you measure the effectiveness? And I come back to Mr. Haribhakti, what he said, that ultimately, how do you tell stories about what you're doing? Because I see a lot of organizations are doing a lot of good work, but they're not able to tell stories about what they're doing. And that creates a lot of positive momentum, not only in the customer and consumer, but with employees and other stakeholders. So how do you tell effective stories of what you're doing to create that positive momentum? So I think in the entire value chain, CFOs can play a very critical role. Number one, in ensuring that the purpose that you say is actually translating into action, capabilities, resources, results, and the adequate governance around it.
Okay, noted. Mr. Menon?
Sustainability is most about mindset change, and it touches across all layers of, let's say, the organization. And this is very, very effectively is something that the leadership, in my view, has to address. And CFO is one of the best placed within the organization who can bring about this kind of change management. So if you were to look at from a change management perspective, it's critical that we create the right kind of process changes, just as my earlier my colleague Harsh here just had panelist in terms of bringing about the sensitization across the organization is so very critical, which can drive the capability building within the organization. And what we had done, a few of the things is, let's say we have within our organization a sustainability per week, which has been carried out now. That helps in terms of increasing the entire sensitization across the rank and file within the organization, getting in influencers and people to speak about, because the entire ecosystem has to change, as again earlier Shailesh Bhai had alluded to, because it's not just, let's say, one element, the entire product change, your supply chain management. You have to look at the whole ecosystem under which we operate, and also where our sets of customers and vendors as well operate. And and this is a key related element which I would say on change management. And second is, being as a key influencer, the management, the leadership has to be seen to be driven from the top. And a few of those initiatives in an organization, as I keep seeing, we will take up, let's say, agendas on ESG. It can easily get diluted because of the other immediate business pressures, which are short term, which impacts you on a quarter on quarter. Your eyes will get taken away. And if this is something which is driven from the top, like in our case, Harsh personally, let's say, drives this, and this has become today a key lens, whether, let's say, it comes to us completely looking at the strategy for the group. ESG is the one particular key lens through which it's being looked at. Similarly, when you are looking at business plans, so it has to become living ESG. And unless we bring it, let's say, to that extent within the organization, that kind of change can't come through. And that's where, let's say, for and these are, let's say, the kind of changes. And within the organization, like at RPG Group, the entire ESG sits at the group CFO's office. So that's how the kind of prominence it's being given through various, let's say, measures where we are evaluating the kind of progress each of the respective companies are also doing from an ESG's perspective. And second part of that question that you had touched about, Amol, from a social perspective, I think it's a very, very critical element. I would say as an organization, a lot of us have been pretty much involved as with respect to the social related initiatives. But from our group perspective, we are giving employability as one of the key kind of issues. And its employability is through a program called Swayam, where we are, let's say, it's a gender neutral upskilling as far as people are concerned. So on one side, it's the driving skills and ensuring that today we have been training a lot of women auto drivers, especially in the hinterlands, and also to take up actual job in terms of driving. Similarly, on the health infrastructure, there's a Swayam Health, which is trying to get in more and more skilled nurses and others as far as into the system. Similarly, on the construction side, we find that there's a huge amount of skill gap as if we are waiting for an explosive growth, especially on the infrastructure side. Those are, let's say, the kind of skills which will be in heavy demand. So I think a lot of those kind of initiatives, which what we are trying, and our target is that as an outcome, we should be touching about a 5 lakh kind of number of people over a period of next 5 years. So those are, let's say, the kind of themes that we are driving, Amol.
Okay. Mr. Sridhar.
I think, Amol, I think there's a lot of stories which everyone can talk about this particular topic. So interesting if you repair. I think now, if I come from a top-down approach, the boards themselves, the focus of the board, apart from the so-called the performance of the company, the strategies of the company, is also now intensified in terms of how it looks at these elements which are important for a sustainable listing. So that means we first at the senior management level or an executive level have to reskill ourselves to look at these particular topics, right? So that means our engaging ourselves with the teams to see a purpose for delivering this particular objective is going to remain the key differentiator, right? So like what we drive the other topics, there's also required the intensity of 2x times minimum, right, to get that change. Otherwise, then it could be a topic which is talked about now, but will lose its firmness going forward, right? So what we do normally is that from a CFO standpoint, first point is ESG has got 3 elements. One, which is environment, one, which is basically the sustainability, other one is the governance, right? The governance, the audit committee is the best of the vehicle through which the governance could always be administered or reviewed. And then the next is about the environment. I think now those topics of net zero, carbon neutrality, and other agendas, RE100, all the stuff is something which is playing out in the market, and we should be able to grasp this and implement it in the right form, right? And for this, investments have to be approved or sort of, committed by the management. And when we are able to make the purpose and the investment meet together, I think we have a winning game over there. And last is about the sustainability part of it. And I think every organization, right, has to spend 2% of its profits on on the sustainability elements. I think we all take pride not only by making profit for the stakeholders, but also being a good corporate citizen, right? So we engage with institutions we almost with an institution which comes up with a commitment of 200 backward female candidates, engineers, who are sponsored for their 4 years of education and then sort of trained within the organization to get their living so that, they are able to associate themselves well. And someone was saying about how do we develop about the community. I can tell you, as in when we started to a journey from our World Trade Center, which was in the heart of the Bangalore, to the place where we are in, the first objective which I was interested to me as to drive out is to how do you make this particular place more commutable, right? So the industry spaces, industry areas, what is there is something which is used by so many people, but not in the right form. If you come to Pune today, you could see almost 3 kilometers of road, which has been taken over by ABB, developed in such a way that it matches with the global standards, right? So that means people are able to move safely. They are taken care in their way, they set a standard for themselves in terms of messaging, in terms of a proper civic sense of driving on the roads, is something what we need to take pride in developing. Yes, it takes pains, but association with these type of initiatives really builds the brand image, and therefore the ultimate goal is also it brings business. That's what I see.
Wonderful, in fact, very meaningful, Mr. Sridhar. And Mr. Haribhakti, your comment on the same, how, I mean, you already mentioned about the data innovation and platforms the CFOs should use or the corporate India should use. You give various examples. But if I want you to summarize maybe in key points, what should be the action plan? Because for the CFOs, the balance sheet, the profitability is the still integral part, right? So how they should
Oh,
align.
wonderful question, Amol. I have 3 outstanding CFOs on this panel. So my friends, I'm going to beg of you to do the following 5 things. Let India become net zero by 2050. Don't permit India to be inching towards net zero by 2070. And the reason why I say that is we simply can't afford to allow the temperature of our only home to rise beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius any moment beyond 2050. And it is therefore imperative that all of us, and all of you particularly, because as you said very appropriately, the responsibility is now with the group CFO. And that's the case in many, many organizations. So that's my first request of all of you. The second is that please push energy transition to the hilt. And the choices of energy transition are so phenomenal. You can get clean power from Tata Power if they are in your supply area. And I'm sure because of their thrust, many other power companies are going to follow suit. Install whatever you can of renewables. Change the design of your headquarters. Make sure that you don't need air conditioning for 12 months in a year. Make attempts to reduce the consumption of water, the consumption of electricity. We can all do this together by sharing. I can tell you that Torrent, for example, is redesigning its headquarters building such a way that no more than 3 months of air conditioning will be required ever, with full greenery and full airflow and light flow and all of that. Third ask from all of you is please embrace the Value Reporting Foundation's frameworks and the ISSB's standards. India should be the leader in adopting these frameworks and these standards. And that responsibility rests on your very, very broad shoulders. Fourth request, please have an integrated report, if you don't already have, for every entity that you are responsible for. And get your people to move into the ERP for ESG, the Netflix of your outcomes, and the TEDx talks of making sure that everybody in your organization lives, breathes, and actually acts. And by the way, I must say, I sit on a board with Harsh Goenka, and even on that board, Harsh keeps pushing for the ESG agenda. So all of us get very motivated to keep pushing it. And finally, and most importantly, make sure that every person you can touch gets completely alight to make sure that they start making their own contributions. It's what each one of us does. Every bucket of water saved, every plastic which is non-biodegradable being recycled, the burning of waste in kilns, all of that will add up to a better planet. Ultimately, we simply can't enjoy our lives if we can't see that percolate throughout every place that we move through. That would be my 5. I beg of you to support these 5 things.
I think I fully resonate with you, Mr. Haribhakti. I think the last point which you said really strikes, because real estate is one function which reports into the CFO nowadays in a lot of organizations, right? And we clear the investments only with those standards which will adhere to these norms. And then we are done with what we would like to achieve on this world.
Yeah. So be
Thank you very much.
be gross zero, not
Absolutely.
net zero, not net positive. Become gross zero. Don't allow anything to happen which will create a carbon footprint or a water footprint.
So, very meaningful one. I think it was a great learning for me. And as Mr. Sridhar said some time back, it's getting quite interesting. But unfortunately, I have to stop here. It's more than 45 minutes. If I get 55 minutes. And but it's pleasure listening to you. Meaningful thoughts here. I'm sure the participants will enjoy it really well. So thank you, Mr. Menon. Thank you, Mr. Bhutani. Thank you, Mr. Sridhar. And thank you, Mr. Haribhakti, for sharing remarkable insights here. And ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned. Don't go anywhere and stay continued with ETCFO Leadership Summit for a few more sessions because the topics are very interesting and the theme is race against time, sustainability, and future of finance. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for sharing relevant insights. Let's proceed to the next discussion. Dear viewers, thank you for your participation and do keep tweeting and posting your comments using the hashtag ETCFO Leadership Summit 2022.